early 70s, volunteer people and a fledgling service that was only 1 year old. So all the idealism was flowing through everybody's veins. With students, Paul Coe was at university studying, and Lyle Munro, Billy Craigie and all the others were young, full on, and pushing for the rights that they properly deserved. So Peter Stapleton, currently I'm a director of the Aboriginal Legal Service, which operates throughout the whole of New South Wales and is one service. Initially I became involved with Redfern in the early days of the Aboriginal Legal Service back in around 1971 or 1972. There was a volunteer roster of solicitors in the pubs in Redfern when there was a curfew being run, unofficial curfew by the police, so if Aborigines were on the street after 7:30 they would be arrested, and certainly if they came out of the pubs closing time and that, there would be 10 or 15 paddy wagons there arresting them. So they started up a volunteer group of solicitors. While I was on the volunteer roster, I went down, just walked into the office, introduced myself, quite frankly I can't remember who to, and just gave an interest of being involved, volunteering, and eventually that led to me coming onto the management committee. This is the early 70s, volunteer people and a fledgling service that was only 1 year old. So all the idealism was flowing through everybody's veins. With students, Paul Coe was at university studying, and Lyle Munro, Billy Craigie and all the others were young, full on, and pushing for the rights that they properly deserved. One of the first solicitors that the service sent out west was Peter Tobin, who sadly died in a plane crash in the middle 70s. When Peter first went out, he was straight out of law school, so his knowledge and experience in law was zilch. Just to show you what it was like at those times, he was inexperienced. There were a lot of charges against Aboriginals. He didn't really know what he was doing, so to give himself time and some space to do that, he suggested to the Aboriginals that he was representing that they all do pleas and not guilty, and in effect he jammed up the court system for a while with his not guilty pleas so that he could get across the situation. At that time I became aware and very friendly with Paul Coe, as I said, was a student at the University of New South Wales, very good friends with Hal, and also Gary Williams, who was a very impressive young man, also studying law, very switched on, like Paul. Lyle, Munro, Paul and them were strong on Aboriginal rights, and in one way Black Power that was running across from America, and that fort was running through. So the management service then switched over to being all black, and the white persons just stayed on as either workers, if they were lawyers in the office, or as volunteers assisting out as and when it was necessary. In the middle 70s, so as to reflect that the Aboriginal Legal Service, which was one service at that time for the whole of New South Wales, even though its headquarters was based in Sydney, I prepared a set of articles, constitution, which really reflected a zone regional approach for representation on the board, representing all of New South Wales with people coming from all of New South Wales. But as it went on, Paul and the Sydney group were quite forceful, and the service became Sydney-centric and strongly controlled by the management committee, which was like, it had strong people on it, as I've said before: Paul Coe, Lyle Munro, Billy Craigie, Gary Williams was there for a while. He was a moderate. The others were quite strong, and they needed to be to push their push for proper and fair Aboriginal rights and recognition that the service should be funded and exist for the special representation of Aboriginal people who are amongst really the most needy in the country, and certainly in New South Wales. But the downside of the Sydney strength was that the regions then became a bit more fretful about being overlooked and thought it was very Sydney dominant. So as a result of that, the West formed itself broke away with a huge meeting out at Dubbo, and determined to break away and form its own service called the Western Aboriginal Legal Service, which was commonly known as WALS. Again, Steve Gordon was involved in that, Tombo Winters, and other leading Aboriginal people who are from out the West. William Bates is still around, Tombo's sadly gone. It's round about the same time the southern South Coast broke off. Eddie Newman was involved in that and formed its own service. So then there was division, which was probably unfortunate. Sydney was still very strongly Sydney, and so the services didn't work as fully and cooperatively as they should, probably as they could have done. But they all pushed forward and operated on the tight budgets that the government put upon them as best they could, with the solicitors working very hard and very long hours. The federal government at the time was happy to break up the services, like divide and conquer approach, in my opinion, whether that was the case, but it's what happened. So when WALS broke off, it applied to the federal government for funding and got funded. Sydney's, the ALS in Sydney then's budget decreased, and the same with the South Coast. So then each of the services through the 80s continued on, low funding, difficult work conditions for the solicitors. Subsequently, which might be touched on elsewhere, let's call it the original 1970 ALS service had to close for various financial reasons and battles with the government, and maybe its focus was a little bit, its focus was wider than maybe just focusing on the Aboriginal people in New South Wales, for probably good and not good reasons. That's not for me to say. So in the 90s, a new Aboriginal service set up in Sydney. Now at that time, I think there were 5 other legal services throughout New South Wales. There was the South Coast West, the legal service spreading down the south coast and across the southwest of New South Wales. There was WALS, which was dealing with the western areas, upper western areas, Western Aboriginal Legal Service. There was Kamilaroi, which I think was based in Armidale and covered there an area around Armidale. And there was Many Rivers, which covered the north coast. The Many Rivers Legal Service was part of a greater social justice organisation, was a division of a Many Rivers corporate body, and the legal service was a division of that. Eventually the 6 services all came together, it was good, and combined and put in a combined tenure. That took 2 years for these services to interrelate to each other, to get understandings with each other, that while it's one service, which is now, I believe, working very effectively, took 1 or 2 years to sort itself out, operating very well and operating throughout all of New South Wales. Just briefly, as I said, there's 13 Aboriginal directors and 2 honorary directors, and I was fortunate enough, because of prior to involvement, that to be one of the 2 honorary directors, and that's been very good and very meaningful for me to continue to do that. Watching the board work, mainly Aboriginal elders, although there are other 40-year-olds who then show their respect for elders, and the way of thinking about community and their family, for me has been very instructive to see that, and I've been privileged to at least have an exposure to that, and while I may not fully understand it. But it certainly has demonstrated to me that the culture and the significance of the culture is real and meaningful, and probably that message is not really got through to Australia. It doesn't get through to Australians enough. I'm not sure how that's done, of how significant the culture is and how real and strong it is for the community. And just very quickly, lawyers working in the courts who can tell you, others could tell you much more than I can, but the things we discuss at the board is how the white lawyers in the Aboriginal Legal Service, while they have a client which is one person in a particular matter, when the matter goes before court, often the whole family will turn up. The whole family will expect to be informed of the facts relating to the offence, whereas the lawyer will only discuss and deal with those facts with the client and not with the family. So the white lawyers have to have a very significant cultural awareness as to, one, how they act as a lawyer, but how they also interrelate to, say, to the defendant's family and the Aboriginal community in relation to what's going on with the defendant. So there is a requirement for great cultural awareness and being aware of it. It is very significant in how the service should operate.